Hi, everybody, and welcome to a mouse guard edition. Is it okay if I call it a mouse guard edition? Is that too on the
Sure.
nose? Perfect.
Yeah, that's good.
Mouse guard edition of Words, Images, and Worlds with comics creator David Petersen. David, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for jumping on and joining.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. The first time that I became associated with your work was probably a year or two ago. I guess that would be about 2 years ago when it was safe to go to conventions again.
Mm.
And I saw the line of people that were like walking up to see you at Heroes Con, and I thought, who is this person and what are they doing? And how have I missed this? And so I very quickly became acquainted with the world of Mouse Guard, and you've also done work for Jim Henson titles that we can
Hmm.
mention as
Sure.
well. So I appreciate the things that you create and the things that you're doing. And I always like to ask about that path to authoring and creating in comics. What was it about comics that drew you in, particularly as someone who I believe has also written and created in picture books as well, if I'm not mistaken.
I've done one picture book uh in the traditional sense. I've done one picture book, and it came about because of the comics,
Oh, nice, nice.
and then also taught me a valuable lesson about the kind of projects I like doing, and it turns out it's comics.
Yeah.
Um but yeah, the path was that I read comics when I was younger. Um but I had all kinds of outlets for my storytelling when I was, in elementary school and middle school and high school. I was interested in animation, and I would try doing some hand drawn animation. I would try doing claymation. I tried doing a little bit of computer animation, not like 3D model style, but like pixel by pixel kind of animation.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, so I'd do some of that. I'd build puppets and try to record puppet shows. We'd film our own little movies. I'd draw little zines. I'd draw illustrations that were to accompany prose. It was like any kind of outlet that I could find to, I'd make up rules for games, board games and role playing games and things like that. Like any kind of way that my friends and I could get together and either feel like we were building a world or exploring character or exploring story, whether it was animation, puppets, etc. So um, comics was just one of those possibilities. Um, and it, took advantage of the fact that I like to draw.
Mhm.
um, Something else I was interested in. So the from that point on, the short version is that while I wanted to be Jim Lee or Mike Mignola or whoever it was that I was, fascinated with in those moments, I realized I couldn't draw like that. Like the way I naturally drew didn't look like those people's work. I could copy it, but it didn't look like it, I was always going to be a second rate version of them. And the stuff that I was drawing looked more like children's books. So I went through college kind of thinking I'm probably gearing up to get work in the children's book industry or spot illustrations for role playing games.
Mhm.
Those are
Mhm.
kind of my venues. And I gave up on comics not because I didn't like comics or, thought it was a bad fit, but because I didn't think there was room for me in that industry.
Yeah.
Sent out lots of packets after graduating to get work doing children's books, doing role playing game illustration, to no response. And this is back in the days where you would physically mail packets,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, to no response other than one rejection, one email saying, or one letter back saying, "Nah, you're not the right fit for us." And I will also be the first to admit, terrible submission packet. Like looking back on it, the work was not good. I was not in a place where I should have been hired. But from my viewpoint at the time, it was like, well, this isn't working. And I just kept my head down and did the day job and, kept drawing and creating stuff for myself. But then a friend of mine said, you should set up at the Motor City Comic Convention. And I was like, but why would I set up at a comic convention? Like I've had dreams and aspirations of doing something like that, but why would I go to a comic convention when I don't have a comic? And he said, "Oh, I've set up at comic conventions for years and I don't have a comic." I was like, "Really?" And so we talked about what he did do, and so I put together I put together some prints, which were literally like printed off of my printer, like my home printer. It was just art that I had done. I printed it off on my printer on paper a little nicer than copy paper. Those were my prints. Um, and then I just had a portfolio of originals, which I had listed for sale, but I also thought were a good example of the kind of work I could do if anybody wanted to commission me. And it was what I think of as like the worst possible, again, bad example of work, like the worst possible portfolio I could have put together, because it was the Swiss Army portfolio. It was the look what I can do. I can do all these things. It had no focus, no concise voice. It was all over the place in theme, in medium. It was everywhere. But in there, some of the stuff in there was concepts for what became Mouse Guard. And people coming by would point to those pages and go, "When does this book come out?" And at first I'm like, "There's no book. No, these are just examples. Would you like a commission?" And after I think the third or fourth person said, "When does this book come out?" I realized I was missing a trick. So I just said, "I'll have it out for the first issue comes out for the next Motor City Comic Con." And at that point, Motor City was running every 6 months. So I basically just gave myself a 6-month deadline to figure out how the hell to write, draw, and self-publish an issue. And that's how I got in. That was it. That was first issue came out in May, and then in July I was going to the San Diego Comic Convention just to walk around. And I had some spare copies of that first self-published issue in my bag to give as thank yous to some people I knew from online forums. And I was encouraged by somebody else I knew, "Go talk to a publisher. You should go talk." And I was like, "Who wants a square book about mice? Does Marvel, does DC?" And he said, "No, but there's some smaller independent publishers. In fact, there's one that just started up called Archaea. They're looking for unusual fantasy. I think they'd be a good fit." Turns out I knew the guy who was running the company. He had given me a portfolio review. So I approached him more from the guise of like, I don't think he's going to want to publish my book, but he's probably going to tell me what I'm doing right and doing wrong. And he's going to inadvertently help me make my self-published issue 2 even better. And instead he went, "Let's publish this book."
Wow.
So yeah, it was a whole lot of magic, right place, right time. A little bit of credit on my part to listen when, to realize when people are asking about Mouse Guard, to not deny them, not to just laugh, "Oh, there is no book," but to go, "Okay, I'll make a book." Yeah, and then everything else just kind of, the success. Mouse Guard, I was lucky; it was successful pretty early out of the gate, and then everything else came because of that. Things like getting to do Henson covers or Ninja Turtle covers, or even the children's book. So yeah, it's all come because of that. But yeah, that's my path. I guess that's the question. That was the question, right?
That was the question. Yeah, I love that story. And was it that moment when people were responding to you and saying, "Oh, when is this book coming out?" Was that the step towards finding that voice, or were there more steps in that journey?
No, I mean, I think I think so. I think there's an easy bad takeaway from this story, which is the idea that you draw essentially like what's popular. Like, this is what people want, so that's what I should give them. And obviously, you should never be trying to create a project that goes so against the grain that you're eliminating audience. But the idea of just creating with only the largest audience in mind, that's not a good plan either. If I'm honest, the Mouse Guard work was the stuff that was the most me, was the most honest. It was the stuff I was the most passionate about. It was the other stuff in there where I was actually pandering. It was like I like the X-Men. but I also know I'm not as great at drawing them. But the reason this stuff is in there is because those are the characters that people are going to know, or Batman villains, or, movie monsters, or what, all the other stuff. Most of the other stuff in there was that was the stuff where I was being less honest about who I was as a creator
Mhm.
and more about trying to bring in new eyes. Oh, this is popular. This will sell. So, I mean, it wasn't so much like, oh, I found the voice. The voice was there. And I got a little bit of confirmation that my own voice was okay.
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean, this is also many years later looking back and having that kind of insight. I don't think any of those thoughts went through my head at the time, but I think there was a little bit of like, oh, cool. People like the stuff that I draw.
Mhm.
And yeah, like, I mean, obviously, if someone had pointed to the, like an X-Men painting or something like that and said, when does this book come out? I wouldn't have tried making an X-Men fan comic. I think I was smart enough to know, legally that's dubious, and also what a waste of my time in terms of creating something new or being able to profit from it. It's a lot of work for not a whole lot of reward. So,
Mhm.
but yeah, it was a little bit of like validation, permission. Go ahead, be yourself.
There's also a really cool sort of affordance to having animal characters. Um, and I appreciate, I know people tend to go, oh, children's books use animal characters, but I also appreciate like not to not to pigeonhole the two together, but Art Spiegelman's mouse.
Mhm.
This way of looking at the world and thinking about history and representing it through characters that are fictionalized through animal representations.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a grand tradition. There's also a huge like there's a grand tradition that's based in with the strength and backbone of the animals can work perfectly as metaphors. The animals can say more about character, about archetype than
Mhm.
we could actually write into personality. But there's a flip side of that coin, which is that talking animal stories always have the problem of falling into essentially the issue of racism,
Mhm. Mhm.
which is that you are born into something and that label follows you, and that label can, in some talking animal stories, also just automatically determine if you're good or bad. If a weasel character is always bad in
Mhm.
these talking animal stories, and it's something that they can't help,
Mhm.
and that even if they try to like overcome that, a writer will either they overcome it, they're a good natured weasel, and then you've got the stereotype of like, oh, they're one of the good ones, which
Right,
that's
right.
that's no good. Or they try that for a while, but their base instinct of being a weasel overrules, and see, you can never trust them in the first place.
Mhm.
And when we try to map that back onto humans, that's a terrible lesson. That's the downside of these kind of stories. It's really easy to inadvertently send out the wrong message.
Mhm.
Um, so it's like there's a blessing and a curse for these talking animal stories.
I remember reading that and correct me if this is wrong, but at one point you thought about having like different types of animals in the story. Was that part of the reason why you chose to focus in on a particular type?
No, the lots of animals was an earlier draft, an earlier version.
Hmm.
In high school, I had a thing called 1149. It was called that because that was the year it was supposed to take place, and it was basically a D&D party, but made up of animals. And there were actually no mice in that incarnation in what was 1149.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, it was much more like Disney's Robin Hood. The animal part was just kind of a facade for human characters.
Yeah.
In college, I dusted the idea off and thought, what if I made it more like Aesop's Fables, where the animals are actually animals And then I can kind of Tolkienize this, and every species becomes a culture, and then they'll have their own like architectural styles, their own language, their own history, their own poetry, their own,
Mhm.
and I won't just do this for elves and dwarves and men and hobbits, but I can do this for geese and bears and ducks and rabbits and wolves and foxes and turtles and frogs. And it's like, oh, that's a lot. That's a lot.
World
Uh,
building, right?
and then there was the problem also of how do you keep, if you have a mouse character that's involved in the story somehow, how do you keep, or a small character, a prey animal, how do you keep them involved in the story without the predator animals wanting to eat them?
Mhm, mhm.
You can come up with some kind of conceit for a little while that it's in the best interest of the predators to, we have to keep them alive, and so, but it's like you can't do any kind of long story with that before that starts to wear really thin.
Mhm.
um and it's also going to be on a like single character case basis. It's not going to be a whole civilization.
Right.
um so yeah, instead of when the hobbits come out of the Shire, the world of men and elves and dwarves believe like they're too little to do anything to make any kind of significant change in the world, and bringing like a mouse character in, it'd be the same thing, except then also those characters would go lunch.
Mhm, mhm.
And I was like, man, I gotta figure out a way. How would the mice even, how would like something like a mouse even survive? How would this culture even survive? And I just zoomed in on that, and I was like, that's the interesting part of the story. So all the rest of the animal stuff is still kind of there. It's just pushed in the background. They just become, because we're all viewing from the mouse point of view, it's all just the background animals. But um yeah, and it was later on that I kind of became more aware of the inherent flaws of trying to remap talking animals back onto humans, and how you can kind of pick up these terrible stowaway morals that you didn't intend on bringing
Mhm.
along to the party. And then I just had to try to come up with clever ways to work around to make sure that those weren't the inherent messages in my stories. But yeah, that was an afterthought after already going, no, the mice, it's going to be solely about mice. And that was just, like I said, out of that failed world building exercise, where I realized the plight of the mouse is much more interesting than the plight of the wolf.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I'm just struck by how many creative choices you have to make, and how many iterations to think about. And I appreciate that you didn't just plow forward with like a version of the story that really didn't work out as well.
I mean, it's nice to sit here now
Mhm, mhm.
and then describe all of that thing in minutes that took years,
It was not
and
an
that
afternoon.
and that those years also weren't me sitting and pondering and contemplating the nature of story and the
Hmm.
problematic devices. It was, I'd get interested in a thing, I'd draw a little bit of it for a while, something else would come up. These are high school years, these are college years, whether it was social life stuff that happened during those times, or school life stuff that happened those times. Like, I didn't plow ahead because I didn't have the time, I didn't really have the creative energy, and I probably didn't have the stick to itiveness even at that point. So at some point I did just plow ahead, and maybe I had a little bit of insight to be looking back at all those creative choices, but I feel like they happened more organically than any kind of like serious pondering session, or
Yeah, yeah.
pros cons list.
People talk about tokenizing stories, and I always keep in mind that he was a professor who went and hung out with C.S. Lewis at the local pub, and like he was a linguist, and so part of his job was pondering. Like he got paid to sit and ponder, so or
Sure.
stand
he
and
also
ponder.
he also studied the myths and sagas and epics of lots of different cultures, to kind of see how they tackled stuff. And he got to, do a little bit of a grab bag of, here are my favorite parts of those, or here are even, as a professor, it is my job to dissect these
Mhm.
on a literary or cultural level. and then cherry pick the pieces of that stuff that works the best, and whether it's I'm literally taking this ring or I'm going to take this concept but apply it to the savior concept. I'm going to apply it to Aragorn, or whatever. But yeah, it was his job to do that. My job was being a dumb student.
It's not a bad job. It's not a bad job to ask questions and figure stuff out. So I was also going to ask, you mentioned the publisher at Archaea being someone you knew you could go to look at your portfolio and give you quality feedback. So I was like to ask about those positive interactions, positive experiences that have been part of the journey as well.
Yeah, that guy's name's Mark Smiley. And years before, I had just gone to, it was the first time I had ever gone to a convention outside of outside of the Michigan. Motor City Comic Con here in Michigan was pretty much the only convention I'd gone to. I'd gone to a couple little like Sunday, almost swap meet kind of shows. But in terms of a real convention, it was only Motor City. And then I went to this convention in Chicago. It was before it was Wizard World. Mm-hmm. And it was my first time at like a bigger convention outside of Michigan. And I had some sample work in my bag. And I was with a buddy also who liked to draw, and we were kind of joking like, man, I wonder what it costs to even like get a table here, what it costs to set up. Like, what would that even be if we buckled down and made a book or something? What else does it take to get a table here? And I saw Mark Smiley for a stupid, like no good reason, didn't have a line. And I recognized his work from some role-playing games. And I was like, I know that guy's work. I bet you I could ask him just, what are the ins and outs of conventions? So I talked to him a little bit about that. And he's like, and then that brought up that I had work in my bag that I could show him. And he just gave me this fantastic review. And it wasn't all positive. It was actually constructive. And he took 20, 30 minutes out of his time to really go over stuff, well, about my work, but also about here's who to apply to, or here are the kinds of places that I think would be right for you, or here are the things to avoid. And I was like, thank you so much. And walked away. And then like a half an hour later, I realized I didn't write any of the things he said down, and he gave me like specific contacts to reach out to at some game publishers. I think you'd be a good fit for this one or that one. And I'm like, oh man. So I went back, and he was signing for somebody, and I just stood in line and waited. And then I was like, I'm so sorry, I didn't write down anything. And he spent again probably 15, 20 minutes.
Nice.
So, and that was before I was any kind of a professional at all. So yeah, when I got the chance to go show him that first issue of Mouse Guard, I felt okay. I didn't feel insecure about like, oh, I'm going to show this to someone and they're going to hate it, or I don't want to hear the negative things, or I don't want to. It was like, I know that even if there's negative things, he's going to be really helpful. So he had a comic at another publisher, his own comic at another publisher for a while, that company had kind of screwed him over. He had to wait some amount of time to not publish anything so that nothing new came out, so that he could get his rights back. And that's why he formed Archaea, was so that he could start publishing his own book again. And after some amount of time of him publishing his own book, he reconnected with a childhood friend who was a more of a business guy, and said, hey, do you want me to go in on Archaea with you, and we can make it into a real company, and we could actually open those doors to some other creators. Mm-hmm. So that's at the point where I'm then walking up with my first issue of Mouse Guard, and it meant that the creator contract was super friendly, because he had been taken advantage of. And so like, so lucky, right place, right time, meeting good people. Mm-hmm. It all worked out. But I would say by and large, my interactions with people in the industry is more positive than negative. I think the negative stories are the fun ones to tell. So you
Right.
might hear them more. I've got stories. There was a guy who at some point Archaea, changed ownership, and I've got stories about that guy, and I've got stories about the jerk in Artist Alley who was a real jerk, and I've got stories about whatever. But most, like 80% of my stories of interacting with other creators are positive. They're good.
Mhm. That's awesome. And also good that this was a person that had a negative experience and learned from it and tried to create a better experience for the people instead of saying, what, this happened to me, so I'm going to do it to other people because this is how it works and you pay your
Right.
dues, which is the way some people seem to approach things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, final official question, and then we can hit anything that we missed. I promised you a brief talk, and I hope I'm keeping on track with that. And that is creative projects that are in development that you can talk about, things that are recent, upcoming events, and web spaces, all of those connection points.
I'm working on the next mouse guard book called Weasel War. It's taking a colossally long amount of time. It has had a couple false starts because of personal stuff over the last several years, including like pandemic, and before that there was uh, my mom's care before the end of her life, and there was just lots of stuff that kind of kept putting it off or having me completely stop and put it on the shelf for a while. And now that I'm back at it, I'm still like, oh my gosh, this is a really complex story. There's a little bit of I painted myself into a corner with when the story takes place. It takes place between some of my other published books. There is I've done one prequel before, and I made sure I took the lesson from George Lucas of if you're going to do a prequel story, make sure that you actually have something interesting to say and not just go through all the beats of things that we as the audience already essentially know. So with my previous prequel, I had subverted expectations and found ways of like not contradicting but making that part more interesting, or now that you view it through this lens, it changes the way you feel about the previous books. This is another prequel, and there aren't anywhere near as many opportunities to pull that same kind of a trick. And so there's a little bit of like, here are all the things that essentially the audience kind of knows or would ask, how did that happen? It's also the like the Solo, a Star Wars story conundrum, right? Of like, if you're gonna do a young Han Solo movie, here are the things that make sense to put in it. Han meets Chewie, Han meets Lando, the gambling game where the Falcon changes hands. There's stuff like that, right?
Right.
Him on Corellia. But the fans already know that all that stuff happened. So it's like, if you leave it out, everyone's mad because why didn't you show that? But if you put it in, it's just like, yeah, we know this.
Yeah.
Not only do we know this, but also we've for years had a fan version in our head for how this actually happened or how it looked. And this is different than the version that's in my head. And so now I'm disappointed, even though there's no real reason I'm disappointed, but I'm disappointed. It doesn't match.
Right.
I'm having some of that. There are these things that either the audience knows happens during this Weasel War, or things that are the natural questions. Well, how did so and so get so and so, or such and such? And I'm struggling with how to get that to work. So I don't have any kind of release date on this. It's just something that's coming. I have to get far enough into the issues. So normally a Mouse Guard hardcover is 6 24-page issues collected into a hardcover, and they come out as issues first. We're doing, and there had been some debate about Weasel War. At one point it was going to be 8 issues, 8 24-page issues, but then the publisher wanted to split that into like a volume 1 and a volume 2. I didn't like the weird cliffhanger that had to be artificially created. we went round and round, and also just time, kind of same thing as high school. Like other stuff was going on, so I didn't worry about the publishing plan. And when I kind of got back to it, I went, guys, I'm really not comfortable with the 8 or the split, the volume 1, volume 2.
Uh-huh.
I said I want it to be 6 issues, but in working on issue 1, I've already realized I'm going to go past the 24-page mark. Now we could just treat that as first issue of Weasel War is a bigger one, right? We have a lot of stuff to cover, so boom, here's this large chunk for issue 1. Like, but I actually propose we do 6 36-page issues, and it comes out to be the same page count as 8 24-page issues. But then it doesn't make sense to split it into 4 and 4 as a or 3 and 3, you know, as 2 separate volumes. Let's keep it as 6. And they're like, fine, that works for us.
Yeah.
So that's the plan. It's going to be bigger than any Mouse Guard book that I've done. I already have more than 1 issue done, but I have to get a lot closer to the end before we can announce a release date and start publishing. Beyond that, I'm on social media. I'm at Mouse Guard on most everything. And I stream on Twitch under my name, David Petersen, Petersen. All the vowels in my last name are E's. And the first Friday of every month on Twitch, I do a community draw along. I put out some prompts, and then we all draw something based on those prompts. And then on my normal Monday stream, you have all weekend to work on it. And on my normal Monday stream, towards the end of the Monday stream, we go look at what everybody's come up with. I reveal my finished thing. So that's an online landing spot for people. That's updated regularly. For all things Mouse Guard, you can go to mouseguard.net. It's a really good hub for getting to my blog, getting to my socials, also getting to my online store. I sell signed books and prints and t-shirts and things like that through there. So if you only need to remember one place to go online, it's mouseguard.net to find things about me or Mouse Guard.
Wonderful, wonderful. That's a great space.
Yeah, I think I'm going to Baltimore Comic Convention in a few weeks. And then I'll be at New York Comic Con, which is a change. I wasn't going to go. I told people I wasn't going to go. That has changed. I have not managed to get the word out as strongly that I am going as I did telling people I wasn't going. So people keep getting surprised and thrown when they find out that I am.
We'll put a banner up on the video.
Yeah.
Is going.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know. I guess that's it. I can't think of other things. I continue to do freelance work. I've got a little bit of I'm under an NDA on a project right now. I can't talk about it. That will definitely, like, I've got a project that I can't talk about that was a freelance thing. That I have no idea when or if that stuff will ever see light of day.
Let's hope so.
Technically, I was never under an NDA, so I could just share it at any time. But it's a small company. I don't want to screw them over. I just hope that someday it'll actually come out officially. The thing that I'm working on that I do have an NDA on, I know that it's coming out. I know that it's going to get revealed, and I just can't talk about it yet. But when it does, you guys will get to see it.
I just noticed your Muppet back there, by the way.
Oh, yeah. That's a Fraggle that I made. Like I said, interested in puppetry.
Yeah.
When I was younger, and then when Archaea picked up the Jim Henson license, which made getting to do cover work for Jim Henson properties a lot easier. Of all the Jim Henson owned Jim Henson properties, Dark Crystal is my go-to. So that's the one that I've done the most for. But there were a couple opportunities to do some Fraggle Rock stuff, and there's a weird backstory about why ultimately I only did one cover. But when there was talk about me doing a story, I just thought, boy, it would be handy to have a Fraggle.
Mhm, mhm.
So I had found a free pattern online, or maybe it was a cheap pattern online. It wasn't even a Fraggle pattern. I think it was just a puppet pattern. And I realized after making a test one, I was like, this is Boober. This is Boober's head, essentially. This shape is Boober's head. And so I just went ahead and made my own and designed him to be like a fresh character in this story. And then the story never ended up happening anyways, but
But you have the Fraggle.
yeah, I've got a Fraggle.
Love it. And I love the Dark Crystal stuff, the Labyrinth stuff, the storyteller stuff. We could go on, but I promise you a short talk, and I appreciate the time that you've spent with me, and I'm glad to share about your work. And I just appreciate the creativity and all the thoughtful steps you put in place.
Well, thank you. Thank you.